Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. Hosted by the editors of Writer's Digest, this monthly podcast features conversations with writing and publishing experts whose insights will help ignite your creative vision, hone your skills, build your platform, and get your work out into the world. Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. I'm Editor-in-Chief Amy Jones alongside Editor Michael Woodson. Today we are talking all about adaptations, and we've called on the Editor-in-Chief of our sister magazine, Script, to join us. We're very excited to have Sadie Dean here with us today. Hey, Sadie.
Hello. I'm so happy to be here.
We're very excited to have you. Yeah. Let's start with the basics. At the surface level, what are adaptations?
Surface level. I mean, adaptations are basically adapted works of either fiction, nonfiction. I mean, in this sense, what we're talking about, I think we're really going to focus on the TV and film world. So, you think of your bestsellers out there, those usually get adapted first. And, they're not straight, page adaptations to screen because that is just impossible. But it's really the essence of that story or characters that get adapted, and basically what we see either in a TV series, limited series, or even, big movies, franchises, think of like films like Jurassic Park, Lord of the Rings, James Bond. I mean, all started from a book, right? So kind of in a nutshell, that's our adaptation world. And there's so many nuances that we could go into and what that looks like too.
At Writer's Digest, we talk a lot about like the craft of writing a book. And I'm just curious from your perspective about the craft of adapting a book. What do you think makes an adaptation a good adaptation? How faithful to the source material do you think a screenwriter needs to be?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I have never adapted a book before, but I've spoken with a lot of writers who have. And especially, in the last 10 years, we've seen definitely like a boom in those, adaptations, especially with streaming, right? Like Netflix and Hulu kind of have a strong hold on that. Having spoken with so many of these writers who do it so well, my question is always, how do you do it? And what are you, essentially, what are you diving into? And usually the biggest takeaway is, they're trying to adapt the essence of the book. They're not going to do a straight adaptation, because we've seen a lot of movies or TV shows where, you're a big fan of the book and you're like, this isn't true to the source material. And it, frankly, I don't think it should be. I think it should be your interpretation of that material. And there's so many, great interviews, what you can find on Script, but, a lot of them also say it's like, it comes down to what about that material that they connected to personally. And that's what they, really like dive into and focus on. So it could be a character, it could be the theme, it could be the world, it could be the setting, whatever it is. And they really dive into that and focus on that. And of course, the book comes into play and you'll have those favorite moments. A movie, that's about to come out of, the second part, which is Dune. I feel like that one is a pretty faithful adaptation, especially this newer version. Of course, there's the David Lynch one, which is David Lynch.
Special, yeah.
It's very special and unique in its own way. But I feel like with this latest adaptation, that team, they were very faithful to the material. And I think they had to be, because it's such a very specific world and there's just so much going on. But they made it in a way that's very digestible for those who've never even read the book. And then make people excited to like, hey, maybe I should read this and like really see what this is all about. So yeah, I think, kind of like wrap that all up. I don't think you should be faithful entirely, like 100% to that material, because you're not going to get it right. The only person who's going to get it right is that author.
Do you think genre plays a part in that at all? Like you mentioned Dune because it's so specific. That is, I think, a really good point. And I think that like, maybe this is an over generalization, but I do think maybe I noticed like fantasy sci-fi stuff are like faithful to a T to the source material, whereas things that are maybe less genre specific, there's more freedom to adapt, really.
Yeah, I think you've totally like hit the nail on the head there, because I think there's such a huge fan base already behind those books, especially in the sci-fi fantasy world, that you kind of have to be beholden to that source material. And I feel like those fans are kind of the most like,
Yeah.
I wouldn't say obnoxious, but they're very like they'll find you and they'll let
Yes,
you
high
know.
expectations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's like something you have to deliver on that end to right for the audience, but it's also, I think like sci-fi and fantasy, you see so much of that being adapted because of the IP and the legs that it has and that it can have, that, and there's such, big worlds that you can explore in that way too, either through TV or film. That there's a lot to play with, but obviously I think a lot of the writers, if they're not the authors themselves, are like trying to take creative liberties, but also stay as faithful as possible to that material.
Mm-hmm. So these days, in terms of like the business and what actually gets made, are adaptations easier to get made to film or TV shows than original scripts? Because they might have a track record behind them?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, easier, yes. I mean, it's really hard to make anything, but I think because of the IP, that is something that is really, enticing for a producer or studio. The best-selling authors are definitely going to get first pick, and get some notoriety or people interested in their material. And usually, again, like sci-fi fantasy, that's usually going to be a big one too. But in terms of like easy to make, I mean, it's a lot of money, and you're taking a huge chance on this being working out. And I think that, especially in the last decade, we've seen a lot of that with novels in streaming for TV.
Right.
And I think, they do like limited series because you can only do so much unless there's like, a sequel or a prequel to the book. And then I think, the other cool thing also is that there's a lot of material being adapted by authors that are actually still alive and like are younger and who are excited by the TV or film world and want to, dive into that world of storytelling as well. So you kind of have a leg up there too. But it comes down to IP. I think if you're a writer, you're an author, you already have a leg up. And if you could write a screenplay and you could adapt it yourself, that's great too. Or just find a really solid team to come on board and just, hope that you can get it made. I was actually just listening to a talk with a really great producer out there in the TV world. And he was talking about adaptations and how, should writers be adapting other people's work, in your favorite book or whatever it is. And he's like, if you want a chance at actually getting the rights to adapt someone's book, go for someone who's not on the best-selling author list, someone who's more underground, because they're more likely to take a chance on you and adapting their work. And I mean, you're taking a chance on them too. So it's exciting for both parties. It's not going to equal to getting made, but there's a chance.
I'm also interested in this like definition of an adaptation, and we're in the midst of award season for film and television, and there's a lot of, and from my perspective, there's been a lot of talk this year about like what constitutes an original screenplay versus an adapted screenplay. For me, this started last year when at the Academy Awards, Glass Onion and Top Gun Maverick were both nominated for adapted screenplay, which I have thoughts. Like, I'm just like, why? But allegedly it's because they were, quote, based on like characters that already existed because of the movies that came before. But the stories themselves were completely original. And this year, Barbie is nominated for adapted screenplay because Barbie, of course, exists. But again, the story is not based on anything. What are your thoughts on this?
That it is such a fine line. I can understand why they would, put it as an adapted source because of the IP and the branding, but it is definitely 100% an original story and point of view that Greta and Noah brought to it. And then, going to like Maverick or Glass Onion, it's based off of other characters that were in other movies. So there is that fine line. I mean, they're not adapting from books. I think there's just, you have to kind of be very direct in like what you are adapting or what it is, because
Right.
there's so many things that you could adapt. You could adapt true stories, you could adapt
Exactly.
articles, you could adapt short stories. So I think it's just such a fine line. And with the Oscar stuff, I mean, that's like a whole other episode. We could go
Yeah.
on about that. It's just, I mean, they should be across the board nominated for everything.
Yeah.
And I don't think adapted screenplays should be, their category for this year,
Right.
but they got something. So
Yeah. Because one of my favorite movies this year was Past Lives, and the screenplay is pulled from the writer and director's life. And so I'm just like, to your point, like, where do we stop with this definition? Because like, is that adapted from her real life? Like, you know what I mean?
Right. And Celine Song, she's an author as well. So you would think like,
right. I'd also say probably, and I could be wrong here, but in the last maybe like 15 years, we've seen an increase in TV adaptations of books and other things, but for our conversation, books versus movie adaptations, sometimes full series adapting a single book. I think of, oh gosh, what's Margaret Atwood?
Handmaid's Tale.
Handmaid's Tale, yes. To you, what are the benefits of using TV as the medium for adaptations versus film, and what are some of the drawbacks?
Yeah, good question. Benefits for going to TV, especially with something like Handmaid's Tale, is that you just have more time to really explore those worlds, really develop the characters and secondary characters, and maybe even take those creative liberties and making, additional, stories, C stories, D stories, and, plot lines that you're going to follow throughout that season, and kind of sets you up for other seasons as well, if that's the plan. There's a lot of stuff that's miniseries or limited series as well. I think, a drawback is that if you were, to take, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but sometimes a book doesn't need to be adapted into a TV show, and sometimes it doesn't need to be adapted into a film, and it should just be what it is.
Thing. Yeah.
Yeah. But there's always going to be naysayers of like, this should have never been done. I keep thinking of like, when I was in high school, like Life of Pi, like that was such a big book. And then when it was adapted, people were like, I can't believe they did this, and this isn't faithful to the material. And it's like, yeah, but you have to make it visual and like compelling in some way. And it's such a like internal journey for this character. Like, you can't make that cinematic. So I could see why David McGee like took those liberties to do that. But I mean, everyone's going to have, an opinion on what should be adapted and not adapted, or what's good or not good. But I mean, I think, TV is the way to go for a lot of books, because you get to have fun and really explore those characters. And like, again, it's like that essence of the book. What drew you into it? What about those characters that you're just like, I have to dive into this world and really explore this? And, speaking of The Handmaid's Tale, I've spoken to Bruce Miller a couple of times, and, he's a straight white guy writing about women in turmoil. And, obviously like, this guy has no connection to this, but he was obsessed with the material and really passionate about it and about telling, the story. And the fact that Margaret Atwood was, is still alive and can speak to him, and he can go to her and say, hey, I'm thinking of doing this. What do you think? And she's like, go for it, and he gets that blessing from her. I think that's really cool. And now he's, making the testaments, and he's doing other stuff, which is really cool. So, I mean, there's a lot of pros and cons, but
yeah, for sure.
I hadn't heard he was doing the testaments. That's exciting. I missed that announcement. So I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, which is you were commenting about who is doing the adaptation, and how common is it for writers to adapt their own work as opposed to someone else doing it for them? Like, I can't just go and pick a book and adapt it. I'm sure there are all kinds of permissions and rights involved in that. And then on the other side of things, I'm thinking, if I were a writer, I feel somewhat protective over what I'm writing, and I would want to be the one to do it. but I'm
Yeah.
also not a screenwriter and have no idea what
Right.
the heck I'd be doing.
Same.
I would say it's pretty common, especially in this day and age, that a lot of authors are adapting their own work because they have that interest. And again, it's like that whole exploration of storytelling and flexing that other muscle. And then there's some authors who just team up with really brilliant writers and showrunners that can take that, and that they can be with, they could be a partner and equal collaborator on that project, to really make sure that the material is still true to its form, and they're getting the gist of what they're trying. The authors, their intentions were on the page, and that the showrunner or TV writer can fully adapt that and express that. I keep thinking of the show. Oh my goodness, what is it called? Tiny Beautiful Things.
Oh
I want to
yes.
say. Yeah. And she adapted that, and she was very, much in conversation with Cheryl, during that whole adaptation process, but also like bringing her into the writer's room and having Cheryl, share, what that character is going through, or what she was, what was the big turning point in this moment for her, in this point of her life, and how that reflects into this season or just that episode. So, I don't think she actually wrote any episodes, but she was definitely a very strong voice in the room. So I know a lot of authors do that too, and they kind of like that and being involved, because you're not saying like, okay, you gave me the thing, you gave me the book, you gave me the words on the page, now go away.
Right.
I think if you have access to them, I think that is such a great tool to have. And then who knows, maybe Cheryl will write a screenplay or a TV show and be influenced and inspired to do that as well. And I know a lot of authors also who are really talented TV writers as well.
So at what point should writers consider like actually working on writing an adaptation? Should it be before film rights are sold, if they're the novelist and their film rights haven't been optioned? Is that the right word? Would it behoove them to work on adapting their novel so that those rights could be sold, or should they wait until things are moving along and the studio or producers decide that they are the right person to work on the adaptation? What are the logistics of that?
Yeah, I think if you're an author and you're wanting to see your piece adapted, like, you should totally give it a shot, because it doesn't hurt you. You have, again, it's that IP. So like the more you have in your bucket to present, the more options you have to sell that thing. And so if, like, producers like, hey, I love the book, we should, find a writer or adapt it. And you're like, hey, actually, I wrote the screenplay. What do you think? And, they could say like, hey, this, could use some work. Maybe they could bring another writer in to help you out, or just you get hired to now rewrite it. But, if there's a book that you've worked on that has those legs, and you are getting people sniffing around who want to option it, say a studio or a pretty big producer, I don't know. I think it just comes down to the business side of it. Like, do you want to wait for the check to clear and then start working on it? You work out into your terms as well. If you're like, hey, actually, I want to be the writer that does the first pass on the script, or the TV pilot for this. I don't see why not. But I think, having both in your arsenal, I think helps a lot. I know a lot of authors and screenwriters who do that. I know screenwriters who've adapted their own work into a novel just so they have it, because again, like, IP is everything. And so if you have it and you have the rights to it, like, it's, under your ownership, the better off you are, I think.
Yeah. It's interesting because I have like mixed opinions about like who should be writing adaptations of work, because it's sometimes I think like I'm as a fledgling writer myself, like I can recognize I'm too close to it, and so, but I also recognize that like I think where people get a little bit caught up in like, oh, they should have never done this, it can't be as good. We're confusing maybe like these are two different mediums, and
Mm-hmm.
like it isn't supposed to. If it draws people to the book, that's awesome. I don't care that it's different. It's being adapted. And so in my head, I'm like, I don't know if this is whatever, but I would want someone else to adapt my book, but I would want a say in who gets to do that, you know? Um, so I guess my question, you've talked on this a little bit already, but like if an author isn't adapting their book, do you have any advice for them on how to like be okay with that, really?
Yeah, I mean, it's you just got to be open to the creative process. You know, someone else who's coming to that material may take something from it that you didn't even
Right.
think of, you know, and you just got to be open to it. And if it, and you don't have to agree with everything. And if you're
Right.
just not comfortable with it, then, you know, you can move on. But, you know, it's such a different beast
Mm-hmm.
in the TV and film landscape, especially in what you are allotted on the page. You know, with a novel, you guys get 300 pages,
Mm-hmm.
500 pages. With a screenplay, you know, we max out at 120 pages, and there's not a lot of text on that page.
Mm-hmm.
And same thing with TV, you know, it could be anything from 30 pages to 60 pages, and it changes here and there depending on where you are. But you're only giving a limited amount of time and space to really tell that story. So, you know, as an author, like I really wish that we could really explore Jimmy's arc here. And it's like, well, Jimmy isn't really that important in this, in my version of telling the story.
Mm-hmm.
But we could take Jimmy's arc and maybe put it into Sally's arc and kind of combine these characters because, you know, again, we just don't have the time or the economy to like to make it all fit in one go. So that's kind of a thing where you just kind of have to be open to that. And I think it just makes you a better collaborator. And I think a
Totally.
storyteller too, once you like face the page again on the next thing. And if you have that opportunity to adapt again, then you're like, okay, this is what I went through last time. This is what I learned, and this is how I would do it differently.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
you get to choose your collaborators and all that. So
Nice.
yeah.
So, Sadie, you talked a lot about you know, these people that you've interviewed for adaptations. What kind of work have you done on adaptations, if any? And if so, what was the process like?
Yeah, so I haven't done an outright adaptation of a book, a novel. I did have interest in a short story that I was really drawn to in my early 20s by an author, Tobias Wolff. And I was like, I'm going to make this and it's going to be the greatest thing ever. And so I didn't know what I was doing. So I was like, I'll just email the publisher. This is easy. And I'll start going. And I emailed them and they never wrote back. Surprise, surprise. And then I kind of just gave up on that. And I was like, well, that's that. But I have adapted in terms of a true story from someone who hired me to do that. And it was all just from them telling me stories about their life and going on trips with them around town and just taking a lot of notes and stuff. And that was a really interesting experience. And again, like distilling, you know, a year-long story into 120 pages, you're just like, okay, well, what am I picking here? What's the most important thing? But I would love to adapt a book, but it just seems so like terrifying because you don't want to like mess it up, right? And you want to like be as true and, you know, like authentic to the material as possible, but also put as much of yourself into it, which is also really terrifying too. So, so yeah, to answer your question, yes and no, I have not adapted.
Well, it's interesting. I'm curious about that perspective of like wanting to and then being afraid to, because you want to like be faithful to the source material, but don't want to put your own spin on it. Because I am actually like very nervous to say this because I don't want people to be mad, but like I'm not the kind of person who always thinks that the book is better than the adaptation. I think often, of course, it is. But I mean, I came to writing because I wanted to be in film. I wanted to be a screenwriter. And when I started thinking about like what I liked about movies, it was like the thing that always came back to me was like, I love a good story. And so then I realized, oh, I read a lot. Maybe I'll try to be a writer of books. And I still want to be a screenwriter. But I think that has offered me a little bit of the perspective of like, if a book that I loved gets made into a movie that is so good, but so different than the book, like I don't care usually.
Right.
They get to be two separate things for me that I get to enjoy. And so I'm just wondering, are there any adaptations that you think that you can think of that you think are personally better than the source material, and if not better, maybe just as good as? And I have a few too, if you want us to get.
Yeah, no, I actually I made some notes on this
Good.
one because that was a good question. I would say a recent one within the last year, uh, Daisy Jones and the Six. I thought the show was better than the book, but I think they're both equals in their own right. I think
Totally.
the way that she wrote it was very straightforward interview style. So it's like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you
Yeah, you
tell
have
these
to
stories?
adapt.
How do you break down these characters? And like, there's so many layers there that she didn't really go into,
Mm-hmm.
which is, is interesting. And then how they took that source material and then made it into this thing that it is in
Mm-hmm.
terms of just going into, making it visually engaging, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
that world, that time period, those characters. And then on top of that, like writing original music and lyrics that go and, coincide with basically that essence of that book as well,
Mm-hmm.
that Taylor
Oh,
put
that's true.
out
Yeah,
there.
that's important.
So yeah, I like the book, but I like the show better because
Love that.
I like that they, as a team, really just dived into those characters
Mm-hmm.
in that world. And I'm such a big fan of just that time period and that music
Mm-hmm.
scene. So it's like, oh, okay, that's really cool. Like just the homages that they had in there as well.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just jump in with a question
Yeah.
about that real quick? Because I did really I haven't seen the adaptation, the show of that, but I did read the book, and in my mind as I was reading it, I was like, this is like a VH1 special.
Right.
Um, behind the scenes, what
Yeah,
was that
VH1 behind the
show?
music.
Yeah.
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 So in my mind, it was like, as I was reading it, it was a documentary in my head,
Right.
Totally.
like on VH1. So did Taylor Jenkins Reid did she work on the show? On the
Yeah, she
adaptation?
was. Yeah, I don't remember if she was an actual writer, but I know she was a consultant and she was a producer on it.
Nice.
And she had a
Okay.
lot of say in it
Yeah.
with that team, and they did stay true to that style of like that VH1 documentary style, but they also broke out into going into the stories and showing that world. So that was
Okay.
what I really enjoyed about that. It's
Yeah.
like, okay, it's not just talking head interviews of where are they now. It's they build up to. I don't want to give any spoilers for the end, but of just building up to that last moment. And you're like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, okay, this like hits so differently now,
Yeah.
as opposed to what you read on the page in
Totally.
the book,
That's so cool. Thank you for the reminder. I'm going to add that to my list.
And it's a really good soundtrack. So get ready for
good.
a lot of
Nice.
earworms on that one.
All right.
Yeah, one that came to mind for me kind of immediately was Normal People, because I really liked the book Normal People. I didn't think it was, the book of my generation, which is a lot of reviews called it. But I liked it. I thought it was good. And then I was like inconsolable watching the miniseries. It was just so emotional. And in my opinion, that's what they made the biggest difference with it, was like the book was very cold to read. I don't know if either of you read it, but the just was like emotionless, and like you really just don't like these people, and you're like, just don't be together. Like, just don't. That's an easy choice. But the show made it seem like that's impossible. Like they are soulmates and they can't be together. And like it's like it was one of those things where like I think about it like once a week. I'm just like, God, that was so good. I'm so glad that someone adapted it, because it makes me like appreciate the book a lot more than I did after I'd read it. Like the show was so good that it made me think the book was better.
Yeah. Was it Alice Birch that
Oh, I don't know.
adapted that.
I'm not sure.
I think she's phenomenal.
Yeah.
I think she adapts a lot of that author's work. I one book and movie that I think that are equal in terms of just being a great read and a great movie. The 1970 adaptation of Catch-22. Like the book is great as it is. It's, Joseph Heller is phenomenal. And then that adaptation by Mike Nichols and team is just
I love Mike Nichols.
So good. I haven't watched the Hulu adaptation with George Clooney, but I don't know, I kind of don't want to.
Yeah.
Because I have the Mike Nichols version, but
yeah.
I think those two are just like, it's one of those things that like it kind of stayed true to the source because of just how zany it is. But they also took those creative liberties and just like really taking it up another notch and that zaniness.
So you mentioned Daisy Jones and the Six. What are some other recent adaptations that you've watched and enjoyed, or that you've watched and think have done something interesting that the source material couldn't do?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's so many books I haven't read that are being adapted right now that definitely after watching the show, I was like, okay, now I have to read the book. And one of those would be, it came out end of last year called Black Cake. Jay Sarah adapted that. And it's just such a phenomenal, beautiful show. And I can only imagine what that book is like, what that read is like. I mean, I don't think I'm emotionally ready to go there with it.
Totally.
Just yet. It's one of those things you're like, all right, I need a moment. But I think, her process too, and just adapting, she again was like just so obsessed with material that it just really translated in where she was at her point in life as well, and how it just spoke to her. I think it just totally translates and resonates on screen. A book that I did read after seeing the movie was Nomadland. That one was really interesting because the book is phenomenal, but it's not the story that we see on screen.
Wow.
And Chloe Zhao took some really interesting creative liberties and taking this perspective of this woman, being a nomad and traveling around in her van. But she took these secondary characters and made that the main character. And you're seeing all this happen through Frances's character. And I just thought it was really clever what she did there and what she was able to portray from this book, this source material, into making it, the Oscar nom that it was.
Yeah.
So that was one that I really enjoyed. I'm trying to think. There's just so much that's being adapted. Everything's being adapted. I mean, there's books or shows that are based on or influenced by. Like I just watched Lawmen, Bass Reeves, and that's from Paramount, and that's based on a book in that historical context. But I mean, I think I'm a big fan of Michael Crichton, so anything that's adapted from his stuff, it's it's a hit or miss. I mean, obviously Jurassic Park is iconic. It's the book.
It's in my top 4 on Letterboxd.
It's a great movie, and the book is so good.
It's so different.
It's so different, but it's just what they pulled from it is just phenomenal. But I would say his other works that they've adapted, I don't think are as good. Timeline. I think Timeline is just
what a bummer. I was so excited for Timeline too. I stubbornly was like, this is good.
Right.
Because I just wanted it to be.
Right.
Amy, what was the one you were just telling me about that you just watched?
The Other Black Girl.
Yeah. I've heard that's good.
Yeah, that's another
really
great one. Yeah. And those writers, they also got to work with the author as well and have her be in the room and help out. And just their approach to that world too it's so cool. And again, it's one of those books where I'm like, I really want to read this, but I don't know if I'm emotionally ready.
Totally.
after watching that show.
Yeah.
Well, and so it's been so I read that book right when it first came out.
Yeah.
So it's been a few years, at least a couple of years since I read it. So I can't quite remember how faithful the adaptation is to the book, but so I can't necessarily comment on like the script or what it did differently, but I thought the actors really brought something extra to their performances. Like seeing, there's a lot of cringeworthy behavior in that book that takes place at this publishing house, and the performances of that behavior, like seeing it in action, it like I physically cringed. It was so uncomfortable, which is I think an awful lot of the point.
Yeah.
But going back to Black Cake, that's one that I do want to watch, but I haven't read the book yet. And this is, I think, where I fall short, is I almost always want to read the book and do read the book before I will watch the show. So there's, tons that I just haven't watched because I haven't read the book yet.
Right. Okay. Two things come to mind immediately. The first one is the movie The Hours, which was like huge for me, my favorite growing up, and I loved it so aggressively that I didn't want to read the book because I was like, this movie means too much to me that I don't want to not like it. Like I don't want like them to get something wrong. And before we started recording, I mentioned that when I had COVID, the last thing I remember was reading The Hours, and is like my greatest regret is that I waited so long to read it because it's just like an incredible adaptation of that book. And the book is, because it's like so beautiful, the movie is so beautiful, but his writing style is so gorgeous that like you get a different kind of beautiful. You don't compare them really. And then another one is recent. Josh and I had been putting off watching Lessons in Chemistry because I just really want to read that book. And we were with friends a couple weeks ago who it's like one of their favorite books of the last several years, and they had started it and they were really disappointed with like some differences, but I'd read really good things about the show. And so I was like, you know what, let's watch it because I want to like the show. And if I read the book, I'm going to have problems with the show. So if I like the show, I'm going to then definitely read the book. And I loved the show. And so now I'm just like, okay, I'm going to read the book and I'll see like what the differences are. But I think, in my opinion, we have more of a possibility of liking both if we watch the adaptation first. You know what I mean?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because with The Hours, I did the exact opposite as you. I saw the film and I loved it so much that I immediately drove, like after it was over, I drove across the street to the Barnes and Noble, and the book happened, it was on a display table right there with Mrs. Dalloway.
Yeah.
And I bought them both, and it literally changed the course of my life. Like, yes. But that was, that's something I didn't think about with adaptations is it introduced me to a writer.
Oh, totally. Oh, yeah.
That I wasn't familiar with before.
Yeah, for sure.
And it made such an impact on my life being introduced to that writer, which you could read about in the January-February issue of Writer's Digest.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, I think of like an author that comes to mind in a book that I feel like I read the book first, but I can't remember. It's so long ago. But Amy Tan's Joylet Club, like both are just so phenomenal.
Yes.
And like you watch the movie and they're like, well, obviously I have to read the book.
Yes.
Or you read the book, you're like, well, obviously I have to watch the movie. But I think that's just what's so cool about storytelling, across the board.
Yeah, totally.
You just get so excited to dive into one or the other. And if we, can make more TV and movies based off of books and it gets more people, especially the younger generation, to go to your local bookstore and buy that book. Like I am all for it.
Absolutely. One feeds the other. Like I think people are reading more now than we have in years. And like statistically, I think that's true. And I think like the more we adapt those things, they'll go see the movie and then it just continues.
Yeah. I was reading a statistic put out by, it's called, the article was like Impact of Book Publishing on the Film Industry. And I'll send you guys the link, but the author said that the films based on books make up 70% of the top grossing films worldwide. So like, if you just like think of that number, which is insane, but just thinking of like, if you're an author and your stuff gets adapted, just how much, money you can make off of that. And then just like your book being, sold again and being front and center. And then just the legs you can get off of that. It's just, it's really cool.
Yeah, for sure.
So are there any books that you would, or I guess IP, that you would love to see adapted that you just could envision being really successful, or that you personally just want to see on the big screen or small
Yeah,
screen?
yeah. One that's just been a dream, and I know they've done it several times. But I think with technology now, there's just a lot more creative capabilities. But the Phantom Toll Booth, just
Oh yeah,
having grown
Mm.
up on that, and I think I have like 3 copies that I've
right.
bought over the years, just because why not? Um, I think that just would be such a great either TV series or just standalone film.
Yeah.
It's just such a fun read, and just that world
Mm-hmm.
is so cool. Um, and then another one that is just so bizarre, and I just love the character because he's so unlikable but also lovable, is A Confederacy of Dunces. Um, it's just such a weird book, but it's just I think there's always someone circling that book and looking to adapt
Mm-hmm.
it. So hopefully it happens
Yeah.
in my lifetime, because I think that's just, for an actor to play that character,
Mm-hmm.
I think would have it right. So those are definitely like the top 2 that always come to mind for me.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, what about you?
Oh, it's hard because I'm reading a book right now that's actually like, oh well, I'm hating it, but I like it reads like he just wants it to be adapted into something, and so I can recognize like, okay, this would probably make a decent adaptation. But books that I want to be adapted, oh, that's hard. That's really hard actually, because
There was one that I feel like we talked about together. Did we talk about wanting Big Gay Wedding by Byron
oh, I
Williams
would
to be
love Big Gay
adapted?
Wedding to be
Yeah.
adapted. Thank you for saying that. Actually, yes, Big Gay Wedding. The Guncle, I would love The Guncle to be adapted. I would love
Yes.
Less by
Yes.
Andrew Sean Gray to be adapted.
Yes.
Um, it's interesting you say that actually, because like I can be kind of a bummer reader. Like my books I read aren't a load of laughs, but like those are really lovely books. And those tend to be my favorite adaptations actually, now that I think about it. Like Crazy
Hmm.
Rich Asians, I didn't love the book, but I loved that movie. I thought it was such a good adaptation. But yeah, Big Gay Wedding would be perfect.
Hmm.
I'm curious, because both of you read so much. Like, what is it about those books that you're like, I would want this adapted? Like, what
Mm-hmm.
is it about those books, if anything specific, that you're just like, see yourself in the character, or
Mm-hmm.
whatever it may be thematically, or just like, this is just going to be a big party on screen and I want to go to there and
Totally.
just see it happen. And I'm just curious, just from like that
Hmm.
reader's, a very ferocious reader perspective.
I think all of what you just said plays into it for me. Also, um, when I read books, they are like a movie in my head,
Right.
which is, I think, and I guess some people don't
Yeah.
have a
Is that
movie
wild?
in their head when they're reading books, but that's the way it works for me. So when I get a very vivid movie in my head, as I'm reading, and I forget that there are words on the page and I just see what I'm reading,
Mm-hmm.
um, I think that's when I want to see an adaptation, which
Right.
doesn't help you at all. It doesn't help other screenwriters or people who are going to
If I can
adapt
see
things
it, do
at
it.
all.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. But I think because I do that, I can picture certain actors
Totally.
acting out certain scenes. And like in the case of Big Gay Wedding or The Guncle or Less, those comedic elements, like I am dying for a good rom-com right now.
Totally. A good
Like,
rom-com.
yeah, I want the days of a rom-com a month
Sleepless
in
in
the theater
Seattle.
to
You've
come
Got
back.
Mail. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
I agree completely.
So basically, what we need to do is just resurrect Nora Ephron from her
Yes.
grave
For
to make
many
this
reasons.
happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um I wish I had more time to think about this, but like the in thinking about this right now, if I think about books that while I'm reading it, I'm like, God, I would love to see this as a movie. It has to do with like what the characters are doing and how they're affecting my reading experience, and wanting to see those relationships play out on screen in some way. Because my favorite book of all time is Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff, and I think that that's an unadaptable book, and I don't want them to try because it's so complicated. I'm not saying no one could do it, but I just think it works best as a book. And there are elements of like Big Gay Wedding and The Guncle that are so visual that and are interpersonal that like I really want to see those scenes play out, in particular with an audience around me, because I do love going to the theater and having that shared experience, because reading's very singular. Like I'm in a book club, but we're reading alone and then we get together to talk about it. I love going to the theater and like experiencing a movie with other people.
Yeah, totally. And another book to go back to, like another book that I'd love to see adapted, which I'm happy to say is going to be adapted, excuse me, fairly soon. That just, after reading the book, just again, like emotionally left me in pieces. But Song of Solomon, Toni Morrison's book. I mean, that first page, like I was just like, I had to close it because I was just already crying. I was like, oh my God, this is already pulling at my heartstrings. But that one is actually in the works of being adapted by the writer Marcus Girdley, who did The Color Purple, the latest adaptation.
I loved the newest Color Purple.
So he's doing that. So I'm super excited. I'm like, this is the perfect writer to totally do this. And Toni gave him her blessing for that. So before she passed. So that one I'm really excited for.
There's one more that, there are two more that I've thought of that I would love to see turned into, one's a film. One I think would be great as a film. The other I could see as a show potentially. The House of Doors by Tan Tuan Eng. I think it would be such a beautiful period piece.
Love those.
Yeah, and I could see, like, I'm envisioning Meryl Streep.
Okay.
From like, the 80s. So whoever that would be now in this,
her daughter, probably.
Yeah, I would say her daughter.
Yeah, her daughters, one of her daughters in this period piece. I think it would be I think it would be beautiful and probably emotional, which I think is what I love and hate about adaptation. Like, I don't want to cry in the theater, but I do.
Can I say, sorry, before I will forget if I don't say this right now. When Josh and I went and saw Room, the adaptation of the book Room, saying you don't want to cry in front of people, like, I was crying so hard watching that movie in theaters that Josh had to like touch me and say, "You're shaking the row." And I was like, "Cool, got it. Let's leave."
Yeah, so that's a book and movie. I don't think I could bring myself.
Yeah, I'm good. It was incredible, and I'm done with it. Sorry, Amy, you had a second one.
No, there are certain ones that I will wait until they are available for me to watch and cry in the comfort of my own home.
Yeah, absolutely.
Without other people.
Yeah.
With my cats. The other one is the Nina Knight trilogy by Yasmin Ongo.
Oh, yeah.
She spoke at the Writer's Digest conference and has a piece in a magazine, an upcoming issue. But that is a wild political thriller series, and I think it is so action packed. I would love to see, like, what's the one with the tall guy from The Office?
Jack.
Yeah. Like, I could see it being an action series kind of in that vein. Not that I've watched all of that or really any of it, but I've seen the trailers. But I love the characters and I love the situations that she gets into, and I would love to see them acted out to see how she gets out of them.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Speaking of actors, it's just a thought, and I'm sure people have done it, but a lot of actors, have production companies and are producers in their own right. I mean, if you have the right representation and you have someone in mind for, one of your characters, it doesn't hurt to try to slip them that manuscript or that book and get them attached. Because then you have better chances of getting that thing made. And usually they'll be more gung-ho because those characters are usually very rich and complex, and like what actor doesn't want to do that? So just some tip there for people who are trying to get in, but make sure don't do it unsolicited, and make sure you have a good team behind
Yeah.
you before you
No,
do
that's a
that.
good point, because you're, especially, I think a lot of, immediately Reese Witherspoon comes to mind because her whole thing is adapting books. And like, even to your point, like, just if someone's getting published and maybe they're like starting their campaign, like, just tell them, I think this would work really well with Reese Witherspoon. Like, they could send an arc to them, and that sort of thing too.
So I think,
Can I ask you guys a
yeah,
question?
yeah, of
I'm
course.
curious because you guys are both writers as well, and probably in the midst of writing your big opus, whatever that may be. As you're writing it, and once it's all said and done and you got it published, is there a writer or filmmaker out there that you would just love to take a crack at adapting your work?
I actually think about this all of the time. And so I also think that, like, I think other people should tell me these things about me, like, I shouldn't say I'm nice, other people should say I'm nice, sort of thing. Like, so, like, I know who I would want, or I have an idea of the kind of person I would want, but it's mostly like, I want them to do it the way they did this movie. Like, I'm theoretically working on something, and in my head I'm like, I want Sofia Coppola to do this the way that she did Lost in Translation, like, specifically. But I also think someone else should read my work and be like, this person would be really good for it, because I'm like, of course I want Sofia Coppola to do it, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
I think we all do.
yeah, exactly.
And I will admit I have given zero thought to that kind of question. Yeah,
Well, how would you describe what
I
you're
don't
working,
know.
what you did for NaNoWriMo? If you could put it in a genre, what would it be?
Well, it has changed an awful lot since then and is now as two separate things because it was too much of a mashup
Mm,
and that was not going to work. So there's one that's like kind of historical
mm-hmm.
fiction and one is like dystopia kind of a
Oh.
thing. And at one point they were together and it was not working.
Mm.
It was trying to shove too much in at once. So, um, I don't know. I think I loved Station 11, which
Oh my
was
gosh, Amy,
also
that's so
adapted
weird you
from a
said
book.
that.
So I could see
We're
one of them being like that kind of
we're
style,
in the
I
middle of
guess.
rewatching that right now.
Are you?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite. That is an
Yeah.
incredible adaptation.
Yeah, it is. So on very rare occasions I've seen like almost reverse adaptations, or I guess it could be called like a novelization where a TV show or a film has been turned into books because the show or the film was popular. And I guess maybe now that I'm thinking about it, I've seen it more in the children's area. Like that happens very frequently, I think, in the kids area. But the one adult example that I can think of, and this is going back a decade probably, was the TV show Castle. And I mean, it was a TV show, but the main character, Richard Castle, was a mystery writer. And so when that show took off, there then became these novels written by Richard Castle. And it was written by someone else. I don't know who. Um, does that kind of thing happen a
Hmm.
lot where there's a unique or an original and then it's turned into a novel or novels?
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of a lot off the top of my head, but like a big one I would say is like Star Wars.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
There's been a
Yeah.
lot of books,
Yeah.
especially in the YA and children's, books as well. And I think just because it's such a big world that you get to play
Huge.
with and all these characters, and a lot of those
Mhm.
authors ended up being TV writers or
Mm-hmm.
screenwriters for Star Wars because they now had like insider knowledge of these worlds that they like created inside that world. Yeah, I'm sure it happens all the time. I mean, I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like kind of that's like where fan fiction comes into play, where
Oh yeah.
people are getting a lot of, again, like those creative liberties of like taking their favorite show and then, turning that into their own little short stories or whatever it may be,
Totally.
because they love those characters.
Mhm.
Yeah, I wish I had more like concrete examples of shows or movies, but I'm sure it happens all the
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
and we're just not really aware of it.
Yeah. The Star Wars example, I think, is perfect.
Yeah, Josh loves
I mean,
those. He's read
how
a
did
lot
I
of
miss
them.
that?
Yeah, same. Yeah. Thank you, Sadie.
You're welcome.
No, but that's a good question though, Amy, because I remember reading like after the first ever, not Marvel Cinematic Universe, but first Spider-Man movie with Tobey Maguire came out, they did I was obsessed with that. I was so obsessed with it. And
It was so good.
it still is good. Those are
Yeah. Even the emo one, it's fine.
Oh, well. The
It
first
gets a
two are
pass. It gets a pass.
incredible. Yeah.
It gets a pass.
It does get a pass. You're right. I was obsessed with the novelization of that. And I was like, it's such an interesting backwards thing, because then they take creative liberties the other way, because there were things that were in the book that weren't in the movie. And I was like, I was a teenager when I read it, but like I was just like, why is this here? I didn't see that in the movie. But you know what I mean? And then the Rugrats movie, when that came out, they also did when I was quite young, they did a book version of that, and I loved that. And it was written from like Tommy Pickles's perspective, so it was like everything was misspelled, and he said it was like a wild book to give to kids because it was like not properly teaching kids how to read. But I do feel like that was huge for a while.
Yeah, I just thought of, and this is a total throwback, but Beavis and Butthead, they also did like a graphic novel off of this show. And I remember like, I still have it. I'm like, this is the like most ridiculous thing.
Absolutely.
But I love it.
Yeah.
And I love these characters, and they're terrible. And then the movie came out, and I was like, oh my God, this is just like this overload. And yeah. But yeah, I mean, it happens all the time. I think we're just like not so attuned to it because it's not like, you know, on your best seller list. But I don't know. I think
we're maybe not the target audience anymore.
Yeah. I think there's totally room for more of that too. It's just, again, you get to have fun.
Yeah.
Well, this has been fun.
Yeah.
I have loved this conversation.
Likewise.
Thank you for taking the time. If the novelists or short story writers who normally tune into the Writer's Digest podcast are now very interested in adapting their work to a script, how can people find out more and learn more from your magazine Script?
Yeah, so go to scriptmag.com. I, along with my wonderful contributors, have done a lot of interviews with a lot of big writers, from authors to screenwriters and TV writers, and adapting. And I think reading those interviews, you'll learn a lot. I think reading screenplays based off of those adaptations, you'll learn a lot. We also, with our store, the Writer's Store, writerstore.com, we have a lot of on-demand webinars there about adapting true stories, short stories, books, plays, everything in between. And then we also have, I don't think we have anything coming up right now, but we usually have classes that are now offered through Writer's Digest University for adapting your book into a screenplay and vice versa. So there's a lot of resources, but yeah, definitely go to scriptmag.com. And we also have interviews just like Tony McNamara, who did Poor Things, which is nominated for best adapted screenplays. So, and I think I don't know, I'm crossing fingers, but we're hoping to get Greta on script as well pretty soon too. So a lot of insight from them too, which is going to be really cool. So check those articles out and you'll definitely learn a lot. And then I coined him as the adaptation whisperer, but David McGee, who did Life of Pi and the latest Little Mermaid and some other great adaptations, he had some really great insight when I spoke with him about just in terms of just how you approach adapting a book and that source material, and just his own process too. And
lovely.
So you can learn a lot, but that's where you can find all that information. And keep reading. Just read more books and read more screenplays, and you're going to learn a lot that way too.
Thanks for listening to Writer's Digest Presents. Join us next month when we'll be catching up with Maisie Eddings, 2 years after she first appeared on the podcast, talking about her debut novel. In the meantime, you can follow us on social media at Writer's Digest or on our website, writersdigest.com. See you next time.